housing should be decommodified. What do I mean by that? I think we all agree that housing housing is a necessity for survival. For that reason, I believe that housing as a mechanism for capital accumulation has really perverted our understanding of housing and has created glaringly obvious problems in America, but especially in a place like California, where 43.7% or 43.7 people for every 100,000 people is homeless here. It's like an insane number. I don't want to mess the numbers up.
Yeah. Now,
but we are number one.
Yeah. My understanding with homeless, though, is that a lot of people come to California specifically because of the weather and because of some of the social services that are offered here. Part of me believes homelessness is not necessarily a California problem, but it's a countrywide problem. Someone could be homeless in, let's say, Nevada, and they get a one-way ticket to California. And that's Nevada's solution, by the way, to homelessness.
Oh, 100%.
Yeah,
that was California's solution to homelessness, was to ship them to Hawaii back in the day.
Yeah.
Another state with a lot of homelessness.
I feel like it's California's bearing a lot of the burden of a nationwide crisis of homelessness. That it's not just because California real estate's expensive, but it's also because the weather and I think the location really support people who have no other place to live but on the street because of the weather.
There is some truth to the way that Texas or red states deal with homelessness as a problem. What you're mentioning, there's truth to that. But ultimately, there are countries that have been able to eviscerate homelessness without shipping them to other places. You know what I mean? Countries that do a much better job of tackling the issue through policy than we do here in California. And it's not like they're killing their homeless people, they're housing them.
Yeah.
And the reality is that public housing or even decoupling housing from the profit motive is 100% a necessity to solve homelessness. Because other than the people that are being shipped to California, let's say, the reason why we have so many homeless people here is because, and I work with a lot of people that do activism in this field, that work with homeless people in general. It's the number one factor is that they get priced out of the housing market. So I call this the different tiers of homelessness, because the most public facing side of homelessness is oftentimes the person that you see on the street that has leathery skin at this point from being under the sun, from sun damage, sun exposure for many, many years, who clearly is not mentally well, right? That is the last tier of homelessness. That is the type of homelessness that this person is going to be profoundly hard to recover and profoundly hard to reintegrate into society and needs a lot of work. Mm-hmm. That number is growing in California as well. But there is an invisible side to homelessness that a lot of people don't even recognize that actually makes up the largest percentage of homeless people. The invisible homelessness comes from people who are housing insecure, people who are couch surfing, people who are living in their cars, but still keep up appearances, have a job, people that don't have access to don't have immediate access to running water, right? But can still figure it out by going to the gym and having a gym membership, living in their car, but then, cleaning themselves up before a job interview or, before going into work. That is the first stage of homelessness. That's the most common version of homelessness. That is the most recoverable form of homelessness. And that is almost entirely due to, obviously market conditions as well, the job sector, layoffs, things of that nature. But the most common reason for that homelessness to exist, the largest pocket, is that they get priced out of the housing market. They have a job, but their commute expands dramatically, let's say. Mm-hmm. And that actually makes it more costly for them when they live 40, 50 minutes away. Ruins the quality of life. But let's say we don't even care about that at this point. They're forced to move somewhere far away, and they can't keep the jobs that they originally had. The job still exists, but it's much, much, much more difficult to go to it now. a lot of people have a hard time keeping jobs like that. They get fired. All of a sudden, you no longer have access to, clean water. You have your car. You're having a hard time. You're being harassed by cops regularly because you can't park everywhere. You know what I mean? You're being called a vagrant, whatever. Then you move into tier 2 homelessness, which is also another massive pocket where it becomes permanent. Like your condition basically becomes permanent. Now, one thing that I always like to stress is that, even bears and animals in the wild need shelter for survival. You need a fucking cave, right? You need something to burrow inside of. You don't just like brave the elements. Mm-hmm. And as humans, I feel like we're all, I don't know if you guys are vegans or not, but like we're all a little bit specious, right? We think humans are the apex predator. We think we're a little bit better off than like, monkeys and the like. We are, when you are shut off from having access to shelter with no recourse, with no way of like recovering that over an extended period of time, that is an insanely traumatic experience. You start developing PTSD. There's a lot of crime that goes on in homeless communities as well. Mm-hmm. There's back and forth assault, rape, and the like. And then you also don't have access to healthcare, obviously. So you start both self-medicating in some ways and also simultaneously trying to make money. Start selling drugs. Start taking the drugs. You start selling the drugs. And that completely paired up with the trauma of not having shelter and not having any job opportunities pushes you into the final stage of homelessness, where you see like a lot of mental illness, a lot of drug abuse, and even more assaults and even more, rape and horrific things that people have to go through.
Yeah. I've definitely seen a very extreme side of things growing up and living in West LA up until really 2020, where most of the people that I would see visually, I think had a mental illness, were severely addicted to drugs. And I think there's no resources out there that address those.
No.
And there was a property that I was considering purchasing that was right by Venice Beach. And it was down the street from the new homeless shelter that was there. That was the one that everyone was upset about because it was in the middle of Venice. And I think the average cost was like $500,000 a room. People said, why do they need to be right in the middle of Venice at such a high cost? And the benefit would be if you sold that to a developer, the money that person would bring in to the community could more than pay for so much more shelter. Why is it here? But I remember following up on that because I knew it was such a big deal for that community. And throughout a lot of the process, it was never more than, I believe, 60% occupied because they enforced a dry policy that they could not bring in drugs, alcohol, be drunk.
You're nailing it.
Yeah.
You're absolutely correct.
But I've also seen a side of it where people just did not want to assimilate back into a community, that they felt more free. I'm not saying this is everyone, but they felt more free not, participating in society and having that freedom really to do it.
What you're describing is actually 100% correct. Yeah. Homeless shelters are actually more violent spaces for a lot of homeless people than the opposite. You would think like, what the fuck? That's a shelter. That's like so much better. It's not. It's actually where a lot of the assaults and a lot of the robberies are committed. And on top of that, if you have items that you care about, or even like a dog, for example, you can't bring your dog.
Correct.
And you have to go cold turkey if you're on drugs. If you have any sort of like abuse and substance issues, you have to go cold turkey. So a lot of people choose not to do that. And while we all probably look at that and go, oh, fuck off, you don't have any fucking rights, why go to the shelter and fix yourself up? The reality is that is actually, as far as like a compassionate and more ethical approach to homelessness, the reality is that this is why a lot of people advocate for housing first homelessness policies, where people have some semblance of autonomy still to begin the healing process, the mental health and the substance abuse therapy process, that is a more permanent and also a more secure way to deal with this issue. But that's on the tackling the existing homelessness part. What I was talking about with respect to housing is usually tackling it on the other side, because there's two sides of this rope. You got to shut off this part and you got to shut off this part. Mm-hmm. This part is being caused by this part is being caused by a lack of access to like affordable housing and being priced out of the housing market. This part is just way more complicated. You have to actually convince people to go into housing, even if you offer permanent shelter. Sometimes homeless people don't want it; they don't trust it, and they're scared. And there is a mechanism of enforcement that you need to engage with there, but I mean that requires hiring a fuckload of social workers and genuinely trying to tackle this issue instead of just kind of playing chicken with the homeless encampments and just like pushing them one street over and then being like, oh, we solved the problem. You know what I mean? Like, look,
I mean that's certainly something, but where should that be for homeless people? Should that be in the Pacific Palisades? Should that be Beverly Hills? What's to say it shouldn't be in Santa Monica, but it's okay in Riverside?
I think that it should be wherever homeless people are. I think that as far as like, it's not even shelters. Housing first policies should exist in most communities. I think that it would genuinely, in the long term, benefit those communities because then you just don't have homeless people on the fucking streets like defecating. You know what I mean?
Let's say Santa Monica would be a prime example of that.
Yeah.
Brings in a lot of business, a lot of technology, a lot of really wealthy people. If you were to put a community of homeless people in the middle of that and say this is where they are and therefore that's where we should build for homeless, it would drive out a lot of the people because they would feel less safe. They wouldn't want to do business there, and I feel like property taxes
make the housing market a little bit better in Santa Monica.
Then you get property values going down. You get less commerce in Santa Monica. The area slowly degenerates, and I feel like then that would continue to spread. So like overall, the benefit would be lower than if you say we're going to put money into mental health, into drug addiction. It doesn't need to be in the middle of the city, but it could exist over here. Where land is more affordable and our opportunity cost is lower, if that makes sense.
Well, the way I see it, as someone who owns a house in West Hollywood, as someone who lived in these neighborhoods that you speak of as well, I lived in Brentwood before, in more affordable apartments, which was fucking awful,
Still expensive.
Yeah, but still incredibly expensive with many roommates. I think that the option is, do you want homeless people to keep moving around and shitting on the streets, or do you want them to shit in the toilet with a roof over their head? And I think like if that is the alternative, and what you bring up with Venice is actually a good idea, because I mean, not a perfect solution, because ultimately that didn't eradicate homelessness in Venice, right? But with some genuine changes into the way that like the shelters process works, with like hopes for permanent shelter solutions, which currently are non-existent. I think that it doesn't matter where you put these places. Like it doesn't matter where you have rehab facilities, for example. Because like think about it this way: property in Malibu is so expensive, right? Well, you know what Malibu has? A fuck ton of rehab facilities. Does that change the property value? No. Why? Because the people that are going to those rehab facilities are rich people. They're the rich people rehab facilities.
But they also aren't necessarily the ones defecating on the street. And I feel like the defecating on the street usually is an indicator of severe mental illness to the point where they cannot function on their own without assistance. And those would not be the people who could voluntarily go and like, I'm going to apply.
Also, that's not entirely correct either.
Not 100%, but I would say
because in a lot of instances, it's just like we don't have public bathrooms. You know what I mean? So where the fuck is he supposed to shit? Right?
Yeah.
Every other country
I'm
you go
talking
to.
about the extremes where you know I used to work in West Hollywood and I would see people out front on Sunset Plaza pulling their pants down in front of traffic and just you know.
People are severely and like genuinely cripplingly mentally ill due to the circumstances that I described. And those people need help. And part of that help comes from, again, like not directly institutionalizing those people, but some level of institutionalization in a significantly more empathetic and significantly more compassionate and more ethical ways.
I would agree with that.
And I think that this is something that like everyone kind of agrees on, but there's a very, there's there's a very shitty part of this conversation that we will never agree on, which is the unfortunate reality that like housing prices might need to be devalued a little bit in the process of like building or not completely abolishing zoning restrictions in its entirety, but at least like allowing for or allowing for certain types of housing to be developed in communities. California has a 55% home ownership rate. Homeowners are very powerful as an entity here in this state. They don't want any housing. They don't want any housing to be built.
I agree with you on that. That's something that I've said, is that the building process in Los Angeles specifically is so terrible. It is so bad. I made a video on this years ago about the process it takes to build a multifamily building here in LA. The amount of open space that you need to account for, the amount of parking. Parking is a huge one. Even if you're close to nearby transit, you need a certain amount of parking spaces for the amount of bedrooms that you have per square foot, in addition to common space, open area, all of these things that make the cost so unbelievably high to build any sort of multifamily here in Los Angeles. And so for a developer, for it to even make financial sense to break even, they have to build luxury units. That's the only thing that they could build. Otherwise, there's no financial, they would lose money on that.
Yeah.
But also building ADUs is so difficult in Los Angeles. And they came out with this program a few years ago saying, like, we're gonna accept most ADUs. And I was really looking forward to this because I have a duplex and I'd love to turn the garage at that point into another unit, 2 units. And there was a proposal that would allow you to build 5 stories if you were within, I think it was like a mile from a major intersection or half a mile from public transit. And I was so looking forward to that because I could take that duplex and build 5 to 6 units. And that would provide a lot more housing. And everyone in my neighborhood would be able to do that. But that failed because people didn't want, and I kind of understand if you're a house, you don't want to be necessarily living next to 5 stories and have people look down on your backyard and lose that privacy. And I get that too. But they make building so difficult here in LA.
Yeah, I agree. I think that they do that deliberately. They do that for one, because like, a lot of people say their quality of life or the character of the neighborhood will be eviscerated, destroyed, right? Or they also don't want their housing prices to devalue either, technically, because now there's more housing availability. You know what I mean? Or because they're next to a fucking building all of a sudden. And to that I say, there's going to be a little bit of struggle there. But in the long term, in the long run, it will yield tremendous benefits in the form of not having people that have been homeless for 5 years, 6 years that's taking a shit outside of your house or just like trying to break into your fucking house, breaking into your car. Like I've had all of these things happen. It's the cost of living in a big city. It shouldn't have to be. There are plenty of examples of cities that have been able to eradicate this problem, not entirely, but have done a much better, have dealt with it much better.